shine so bright. Pull your hat down, make sure your cinch is tight. Horse is kinda snuffy, cold chill up your spine. You'll get your ass moving, son, we're burning daylight.
Howdy there, I'm Matt McKinley and we're burning daylight.
In the saddle till the job's done right.
Welcome to Burnin' Daylight, the only podcast for the working cowboy. Well, howdy there, daylight burners. Happy Monday. Got a pretty interesting episode for you today. I meant to record this last night, but the more I got into my research, the more I figured probably better take a little closer look at what we're talking about. And you know, here in the U.S., we have a tendency, I don't know if it's the same way around the world. If I bet France is kind of similar to us. You know, French are kind of known to be sort of arrogant people. And that's kind of it's one of the labels we've got as Americans from, you know, people overseas. And right or wrong, I'm not going to comment one way or the other. It's not really a debate. That's how a lot of foreigners see us. But we have a tendency to focus on history here. Like, you know, history for us started at 1776. Yeah, so anyway, I think when you start looking at these deals, and in particular the meatpacking industry is one thing that it's really interesting, because it's always been kind of an industry dominated by poor immigrant labor, but it has its origins going way back. I mean, essentially since people have been domesticating animals for meat production. Anytime there's been some sort of urban center, there has to be people that feed the urban center, you know, the farmers, ranchers, sheep herders, you know, whatever it may be. Now there's certain societies that I don't necessarily know they have like a meat packing industry, but they still eat meat. I mean, you can, if you look at like the Afghan countryside, it's essentially just a bunch of like tribes, and they're kind of nomadic and sheep herders and hunter-gatherer types, and so there's always been a need ever since humans started eating meat. So since the beginning of time, there's always been a need for somebody to kill, dress, and butcher an animal for human consumption. And I guess the first, they say it started in like the history of butchery. I'm reading an article here, and this is from DelanceyPlace.com. I guess I can go ahead and pop it up on the screen. But, you know, there's oh, now I gotta, yeah. All right. Now we should be good. Maybe not. I don't know. I'm gonna try to share the screen with you, but there we go. What the heck? Well, maybe I won't be popping up on the screen, so I'll just read from it and you'll have to believe me. But it's from DelanceyPlace.com. I'm having a real boomer moment with my technology here lately. Meat only became part of man's diet 800,000 years ago, while the origin of our species is dated back almost 2.5 million. Butchery as we know it today had its beginnings in ancient Rome. In addition to fine wine and sewage systems, we also have the Romans to thank for the way they practiced butchery across the empire, with archaeological evidence showing us that they introduced the first cleavers and large slabs of wood similar to what we'd now call a block, butcher block. As populations increased with the size of the Roman Empire, so did the need for farming and cultivation of livestock for meat, leading to the beginning of what we would now recognize as wholesale farmers who supplied animals directly to early butchers. These butchers were called carnifexes, a word that would soon become associated with Roman murderers and executioners, and they sold their wares from wooden carts beneath a cotton canopy. I'll keep on going here. Many carnifexes dealt in a wide array of meat, while others were specialists selling only bone marrow or hooves. The divides in Roman society saw the meatier cuts at the very beginning of what we now classify as prime cuts go to the rich, and the cheaper, less desirable to the poor. That's also been a case all the way up to today. The Romans were also pioneers of the nose to tail butchery, which may be trendy now, but began in the early 1st century. Originally, nose to tail was necessary for feeding an ever expanding population. Nose to tail includes the offal, the the entrails, and organs of an animal, bright plump livers, tough and flavorful hearts, and even soft spongy kidneys. And then it goes on to the U.S. In the U.S., the supply chain historically began in localized rural areas, with Chicago becoming the headquarters of the American meat industry by 1865, when the Union Stockyard and Transit Company was built on more than 350 acres of downtown Chicago by a group of railroad companies. The yards was split into two sections, one section that sold livestock a la Smithfield, and the other was built for processing of carcasses. For more than a century, this was the central hub of meat processing in the U.S., as farmers from all over the country shipped their cattle, sheep, and hogs to be sold and slaughtered on site. So we went from essentially like a family or a tribe. Well, think of it a lot like the Native Americans. You know, when they went on a hunt, they hunted their buffalo, whether they're shooting with arrows or whether they're running them off a cliff, or and later on with rifles. They'd go on a hunt, they'd kill their buffalo, and then it was the whole tribe partook in the harvesting of it. So you'd have the warriors and the hunters that would go kill it, and then everybody jumped in, you skinned it out. And so, I mean, we don't even have to go back to Rome to talk about the nose to tail use of an animal. We could stay right here in America and go back even further. Well, I guess not even further, but like go back a long damn ways with the Native American killing the buffalo and harvest it and using literally every part of it. I mean, the blood was saved. They they drank it. They just many different uses for it. The hides, obviously, the sinew, the guts, all of it. I mean, the first thing they did was cut out the liver and eat it there on the spot. You know, eat it raw. Squirt a little gallbladder bile on it, and yeah, that the animal was harvested and it was used to its fullest extent. The Romans are the ones that I guess first kind of commercialized it and made it an occupation rather than and I don't buy that the Romans were the first ones to do it, because there were cities far before Rome and and far newer than, you know, go back to ancient Egypt, and I bet you there was somebody there that his job was a butcher, and I think it's one of those jobs that's always been there. It's always will be there. It's kind of like the herder, you know, whether it be a cowboy or a sheep herder, goat herder. There's always been a human to watch over your animals, your herd, your flock, and that I don't see that changing anytime soon. I mean, you might be able to babysit them a little more at arm's length when, you know, with like drone technology and stuff. But either way, there's there always has been, and from how I see it, there always will be somebody that takes care of animals like that. Just like there's going to be somebody whose job is to kill that animal and break its body down into cuts of meat, and with that, there's always going to be somebody who processes the byproducts, takes the hides, takes the entrails, the bones, and everything. Just we're a pretty industrious people like that. Like people get lazy, but um, when it comes to making money like that, those packers are really good at squeezing every little bit of money and product they can out of an animal. I mean, it's uh, I'm I'm rereading Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, which you have to. Oh, we'll get to that, but um, one of the lines in there, and it's kind of a common line throughout the pork industry, is just like they use everything of the pig but the squeal, and it's pretty true. But it's funny. We went from kind of your local clan leader, tribe chieftain, head of the family, whatever, would usually be. I guess just depending on the culture, but you just have you had a very small group of people, and then you didn't need a ton of meat. You'd shoot your animal or kill it however you did it, and if it was a big enough animal, say like a deer or something like that, that was meat enough to last you for a little while. The problem with meat is it spoils real quick, and so until the invention of refrigeration of meat, there's the meat packing industry has always been kind of seasonal, because you wanted to do it in the cold winter, so you were able to preserve the meat for as long as possible without without like smoking it or curing it or something like that. So anyway, I going back to Rome, this article says that Romans invented butchery, but I have a hard time buying that. They might be the first credited with it, but I think there's always been, ever since there's been like urban centers, there's had to have been somebody. But I mean, they had markets, open air markets, kind of like going to Chinatown in New York now, or like the wet markets in China, or the bazaars in the Middle East, and it's it's they still live, those people in those cities, they still live a lot like their ancestors did, where it was just it's a like it's just like think of the markets as a whole. Like you have your energy market, you have your cattle market, you have your corn market. In a bazaar or a wet market, like you have just the market, and it's got all of that shit thrown in, and people are haggling back and forth, and it's a messy place. But there's always, whether they're live animals or cuts of meat hanging in those, and I'm sure there were back in the day too, and so I just, like I said, it's maybe the Romans get credit for it, but it seems like I don't buy it quite so much. So, but they were kind of one. They did it a different way. It seems like, maybe, or at least they were the first one to use this technology, like a cleaver and a butcher block, rather than like the Middle Eastern guys, where you'd have it on a spit or whatever, and then you just cut pieces of it off as you go, and there wasn't much need for a block that way. And so I guess maybe it was the Romans that kind of maybe pioneered like the different cuts, I guess, and rather than just like cutting off chunks of meat. Like you could, I guess you could always tell them, like, well, give me some of that part, like say it's a whole hog or something, like, oh, no, I want some of the loin and the shoulder. I don't really want the hams. but you were essentially just buying however much meat, and I guess they just slice it off the animal right there, and then the Romans turned to putting it into cuts, and like the Italians are well known for having great steak. It's if you think about like the different places throughout the country that are known to have like an excellent steak, they're all they're all either in cattle country or they're in cities that used to be like packing plant hubs. So like Chicago's got some excellent steakhouses. Fort Worth has some excellent steakhouses. New York City, Boston, they all had these thriving packing plants that and then of course in England too, they were known for raising some of the best cattle and the best quality meat, which they then boiled to oblivion, and thus you have shitty British cuisine. But that's not of. I mean, it is of historical fact, but it's also um, opinion based. In my opinion, it's just funny that old saying like the Brits conquered the entire world to gather up all the spices, only to use none of it in their food. And yeah, like, and I guess it comes from just how they cook over there. It's a cold, damp place, always raining, so like they made a lot of soups and like thick stew type stuff. And I don't know it, but they were known for the best meat, beef anyways, until America imported some Herefords, and I don't know when they imported Angus, but until America started importing cattle that were bred for meat consumption, that are like specifically for that, then we overtook England real quick, like, because we're America, fuck yeah. And so anyway, you go. The Romans took this method with the cleaver and the block and the breaking down into individual cuts. At least I don't rudimentary cuts. Anyways, I don't know if they. I don't know. The Romans were pretty advanced, so but it just spread throughout Europe like that. And then whenever there would be a city that would spring up, there would be people there to feed them, and that has always been the case, always will be the case. I mean, it gets a little more decentralized nowadays, but we're talking the origins here. It was always where people moved and clustered and grew. There was an increased demand for food, and then later you'd have people that would specialize. They'd drive cattle to a certain area outside that urban center and start their cow herd there, and they would drive them into the city to the butcher, and the butcher would sell the meat to the residents of the city. So for a very long time, it's kind of weird and throughout history, you don't hear a whole lot about like the urban versus rural divide in like ancient history. But I would bet that it was there, just because it's always the case where like there's people that live out on the out in the country, and they raise, either farm and raise crops to harvest and sell, or they or they raise animals to butcher and sell. And then there's the people in the city that need that food, but they're not involved with the harvesting of it and the growing and the harvesting. So it's I think that always that divide has been there to a certain extent. But with the Romans comes like the kind of the early cattle ranchers, and like the Spaniards in particular were always known for great horses and being good with cattle. That's where the whole American cowboy originated from, like Spain, Morocco area. of herding cattle horseback. And with all of that, they you see the rise of this industry, the butcher, and you also see from the very get-go it was not a real desirable, it's not a glamorous profession at all, and then later became synonymous with like a murderer, or what they say the other one was, like murderer or carnifex. I can't remember. With Roman murderers and executioners too. So yeah, if you were the executioner, you'd be called a carnifex. Same way the murderer. And then as you see, like we'll pop over to America. So you have here we go. William Pynchon. Talked a little bit about him earlier in the earlier episode, but he created what was known as like the first packing house in the United States. And being as early United States, so it was like 1636 is when he founded Agawam, and it was later called later named Springfield, because that was the place he was born in England, I guess. But he he was a fur trader, and by all means, like a pretty excellent businessman. And I would imagine he was it seemed to be that he was kind of like a Brigham Young type fellow when it came to the Indians. Like, I don't know if he maybe he might have been a little bit more friendly to him, but by and large, they kind of went out of their way to try to make friends with the local Indian population, and it pissed off some of the other colonies. So there was it was right on the edge of Connecticut and Massachusetts, which is I don't know exactly where that's at. I've been through those states before, but looking at them on a map, I couldn't tell you. They're so small that it's hard to see them on the regular American map of America. But yeah, and then when you zoom in, I'm just like, I don't know. I know the geography of basically everything outside of New England pretty well, like shape wise, but New England not so much. New York's easy because it's a pretty big state for that part of the country. But anyhow, he was on the border of Connecticut and Massachusetts, and he set up at a good spot where there was water, and it was a spot where they would have to move overland to go from a large river to another large river. The the rivers right there were a little too small to cross, and so he set up. It was a good thoroughfare where people had to move their stuff overland, and so it became a hub for trading furs up in Boston or wherever. It was it was a good middle point. And with that, he also started shipping cattle to the East Indies or West Indies, and then and also canned pork. He I read some article, I can't find it now, but he found some way of, I think it was salt pork is what he was sending. So they just stuff the pork in these barrels and just salt the hell out of it, or smoke it, and then, or probably both. It's anyway, it was that was like the first established packing house in the United States, and I imagine it was a pretty small scale operation. If I was to guess, there weren't that many people um, uh, in the United States at that point. Like there was the Native Americans, but they didn't need our salt pork. They had their own way of getting things. They had their own shit going on. But as far as the settlers and the colonists there, they were pretty few and far between that early on. There's not a ton of people. But as always, as more people came over and people started to die a little bit less as they came over, and then they brought over the diseases that the Native Americans were completely just naive to. Their immune system had no idea what the fuck. Estimated like 90% of the population was wiped out, but with that, like European settlers came over in just swarms, and just more and more all the time, and they kept pushing west, and the further west they pushed, they would pop up another urban center, and Cincinnati was another one where it popped up. It's on the river, and it's kind of the it's kind of the gateway from like the agricultural Midwest to the mining country of Appalachia, and they set up a packing plant there, killing hogs, and they were able to find a way to cure and pot the meat, and they started. We'll go pull up Porkopolis, That's what they called Cincinnati back in the day. I don't know if they still kind of go by that or not. I don't know much about Cincinnati, but Porkopolis. I don't want to see the review of the book. I just want to read an article about it. Anyhow, just because of the location on the Ohio, I think it's the Ohio River, just they made it a perfect spot for the meat packing industry to thrive right there. It was the people back east wanted the meat. The country as a whole was becoming more and more industrialized as with the invention of the cotton gin and as the industrial processes that they had going on over in England were getting transferred over to the United States. The cities in the east grew bigger and more crowded, and they had a bigger demand for meat. Through different wars, we had a higher increased demand for meat because as you raise an army, and this is one thing that we are, I won't get into. Well, we can go ahead and because it all plays in, but the United States never really had a standing army until World War, kind of between World War I and World War II, but it was like not nearly as big as it was during World War I. But it also wasn't like after the Civil War where like the state militias just went home, and so each side in the Civil War, the states raised their own militias, and and that made up the Union and the Confederate armies. There was the Union Army, but they were all made up of regiments from different states. It was like the 75th, Virginia Mounted Cavalry or something like that. And even though they were part of the Confederate Army, it was this unit. So you had like the 15th Ohio on the Union side, and they were all part of the Union Army. Whereas now we have just the consolidated branches, and then we have National Guards by state. But The point being is like your National Guard is like 2 week or a weekend a month, 2 weeks a year. That was their kind of their slogan for the Army National Guard, and so it's not a standing army. The National Guard's not. Whereas the U.S. Army is now like it hasn't. I mean, even after the Civil War, there was the Indian Wars, but you had a pretty small military. Once the wars stopped, the military shrank pretty dramatically, and the provisions were not nearly as extensive that they needed. But as soldiers went home, a lot of times they'd go to the city looking for work. Particularly after the Civil War, there was after the Southerners went home after the war ended. I mean, the South was devastated, just devastated. The Sherman's March to the Sea, where they just burnt everything to the ground. They killed off all the livestock and just broke the back of the South. And so a lot of them migrated west, and started. They took cowboy jobs. They took mining jobs. They took scouting jobs. Some of them stayed in the army and went to fight the Indians. And with that, everywhere there was a new fort, there was always somebody pushing beef up there to it. Kit Carson did it before, and then Charlie Goodnight, Oliver Loving. That part of what they did was they drove cattle to Bent's Fort, and the whole meat packing industry from there. I mean, you had a butcher at the forts, and then you had all these kind of frontier outposts that eventually grew into major cities. So you had like Cincinnati became a pretty major city. It's a smaller scale now, but Chicago was it's the third largest city in the U.S. and that was built on meat packing. And further west you go, Kansas City, Omaha, Fort Worth, and then you had all through the South. You had smaller scale stuff like that as well, on the beef side of things. But on the pork, it was really regional too. Not regional, but seasonal. Particularly with like the hogs, they butchered them in the fall, and because pork is a little easier to preserve, by smoking and salt pork and curing and potting and all of those methods. It was a little easier to to be able to preserve hogs, but they typically killed them in the fall and winter, so they could keep them cool throughout the winter months. And then cattle was it was just cyclical. Beef was a lot harder to preserve unless you just turned it into jerky. But I mean, like even like your typical smoked meat, smoked beef isn't going to last near as long as say like a cured smoked ham. It's just lasts longer, and so beef was eaten pretty well fresh, and so there was always some sort of like there was some sort of beef packing industry throughout all this, and it was more just like local butchers more than anything. And then as these centers grew, then you got the butchers got bigger, and then they hired more people, and we eventually there was a lot of immigrant labor coming. Not only like some of these early American meat packers, they went over and brought skilled laborers from Germany and the Slavic countries to come over and work these packing plants, because they were butchers by trade, and they knew what they were doing, and they were very good at it. They were very skilled workers, and they were kind of like the first wave of packing plant workers. And then as industrialization just further increased and technology increased, and they were able to form this what they called the de-assembly line, where you just moved the side of beef on down the way, and you had the guys that would bone it out. You had just different stations, and the more and more it became what we know now. It's the less skilled the laborers were that they got. And if you read Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, I do highly recommend it. He's very much he was an avid socialist, and that was kind of his famous quote is he was trying to essentially get through the message of the wonders of socialism through this book. But instead, he just kind of grossed out the country about how their meat that they were buying and the process that went through it. They were horrified by it. So he had a quote that said, "I try to hit America in the heart, but I missed, and I hit him in the stomach." And so he describes some of the just the horror show that some of those early meat packing plants were. But essentially, like Chicago is where this one takes place, and you could go down to any one of the packers and in the stockyards area, and if you didn't have a job, you just wait outside, and the foreman would kind of look over the gate, and if they saw a big strapping dude, they'd like, all right, come on in. And then it was anytime you get into one of these big kind of mechanized, industrialized situations, the turnover rate on your employees is just like through the roof. I mean, it's just constant turnover, whether it's feedlots, like auto plants, meat packing plants, like the railroads, same way. It's constant turnover. But America being the place that, kind of the last kind of frontier on earth, and we had this new idea of individual liberty that didn't really exist really anywhere else in the world. People flocked here, and they were just like this guy Jurgis, that the main character in the book, is from Lithuania and doesn't speak a lick of English, doesn't really speak German, and they don't know what it is they're doing. But he was a big strapping dude, and he only had to wait outside the gate for about 30 minutes before he got a job, and he was the guy that shoveled the guts on the kill floor. So they did, and it was pretty brutal back in those days, where they just run them into kind of a stall, and then you'd have a guy with a sledgehammer just blast him in the forehead, and hopefully you got him in one foul swoop. And then they would, before the steer would get back up, they would hook a chain on him and drag him up, slit his throat, and out the guts there. And then there was this poor Jurgis fellow that would go over there with a shovel and just shove it down this grate where the offal would fall down there, and they would there was a different part of they'd either go to a different plant, or they would do whatever they did with the entrails and the and the different intestines and stuff, that whatever they used it for. Like, I mean, it dropped through a little grate in the floor, but sometimes they wouldn't get the steer stunned correctly, and he would get on the fight, and they just get some poor fucking Lithuanian immigrant that's been here for 30 days. It just gets absolutely bulldozed by a half mad steer, and then there's no health insurance, so that guy just pretty well out of a job, and once he gets healed up, he has to go start all over again. He might have been a guy that he had to wait for 2 weeks before he got a chance at a job, and now you got to start all over, and they were making like 15 cents a day or some shit like that. Really wild situation, but it all follows just the flow of people. It always, whether it was and then we can go back to the Revolutionary War, where Boston became just the meatpacking center of the United States, particularly beef, and that all had to do with a contract with the army to provide so many pounds of beef to feed this Revolutionary Army, which again was a bunch of farmers that formed militias and then made up the ranks of the revolution, the American army. And all those farmers no longer were farming; they were fighting, and so before that they worried about their own food, but now they're in the army, and the army's got to feed them, and so somebody's got to find that food to give to them. And this fella in Boston that started he saw the need for it, and it's the same way with this what was his name, William Pinchon. Yeah, there was a need for beef and salt pork in the West Indies, so he started packing it up himself and shipping it over there, and it turned out to be very profitable for him. The same way with the fella in Boston, he signed a contract with the Revolutionary Army for cattle. The first cattle drive in 1779, it was the Spaniards trying to help kick the Brits out, and I still don't know if they ever got any of those cattle to where they intended to go, but they at least tried anyways. But and then along in the Civil War, there were spots along the coast of Texas that that were also same way. They were sending beef to the Confederate Army, and you had what little men were left in Texas at the time. They would drive some cattle to to the coast there, and there were early packing plants there that would it was a lot of gross shit they did back then, but they didn't know any better. It was trying to preserve meat was the name of the game, and refrigeration was essentially non-existent. There was a few attempts early on, but it really wasn't until like 1870 with I think it was a Gustavus Swift. So Gustavus Franklin Swift, born in West Sandwich, now Sagamore, Massachusetts. He was the founder of meatpacking company Swift, and the promoter of the railroad refrigerator car for shipping meat. So this is the guy that really changed the game. So there was ways to there was ways to go about preserving. They had potting, pickling, curing of all these different meats, but as far as like the steak cuts, I mean, those had to be eaten just damn near immediately, because there was no way to without like jerking it or smoking it. Like that. This was a fresh product, and you had to move it pretty quickly. It had to be, or it'd go bad. And not that stopped those packers much. They used everything they could and everything that was allowed, and there was a lot of shit allowed. It was kind of was open season. So butcher's helper at the age of 14, Swift became a buyer and slaughterer of cattle in 1859, and also opened a butcher shop in Easton, Massachusetts. became the partner of James A. Hathaway, a Boston meat dealer, in 1872. 3 years later, Swift was a cattle buyer for the firm, transferred his headquarters to Chicago, where the center of the cattle market had shifted. Swift felt that meatpacking would be more profitable than meat selling if a method could be devised for shipping fresh meat from Chicago to the east, instead of sending live cattle to be slaughtered on arrival, as was the custom. So you imagine being a steer back in the, like, you're a Texas Longhorn, which they bred specifically the Longhorn because they were tough and they traveled out and they could make these long drives with minimal death loss anyway. So it was say you're driving from somewhere like the Texas, Arkansas, that Texarkana area, and they're driving you all the way up to Chicago, where some of them are going to get slaughtered there to feed the people living right there in Chicago, but the rest of them are going to be loaded on a train and shipped back to Boston and New York City and Philadelphia to be slaughtered there. And that's where, like, the early kind of industrialized meat packing plants were. But once again, there wasn't much refrigeration at all. They had a way of putting ice, like making an ice box, but it was very much a fresh meat industry. So he hired an engineer to design a refrigerator car. The finished design circulated fresh air that was chilled by passing it over ice. And in 1877, Swift successfully shipped the first refrigerator carload of fresh meat to the east. And soon afterwards, he left his partner, and he formed a partnership with his brother, and then he made it a corporation in 1885. And then later on, he would join up with a bunch of what they called the Big Five, and it was Nelson Morris, Philip Armour. I forget who the others. Yeah, they called themselves the National Packing Company, or the Beef Trust, and they dominated the entire meat packing industry in the United States. It was funny though; they weren't nearly as centralized as we are today. But that's another another topic. But as you can see, as the population expanded and grew, there pops up these little towns, which later grow into pretty big towns, and in the case of Chicago and Kansas City, like pretty major metropolis areas, and Denver as well. Denver was also an early packing town, and I don't think they have many. There's like some dog food plants and stuff around Denver, but I think, Greeley, that's a whole we'll have to go off on another episode but I want to spend on the next episode a little bit more on the Beef Trust era, and go a little more into, we'll read some segments from Upton Sinclair, and go into like just how ugly of a business it was, particularly early on. I mean, it was it's never it's never been a glamorous industry, but when you take an already kind of dirty, not romantic profession, and then you add industrial, Gilded Age giants who were they were building, the industrial base of America, but and using not a whole lot of good ethical methods to do so. It led to some really nasty shit, and and it's worth kind of diving in, and it's one of the industries that really gave socialism its start. Just the industrial age in general, it was the sheer terrible working conditions and awful pay and the exploitation of the people that worked in these industrial industries, industrial industries, in these factory type, whether factories or packing plants or coal mines. They, I mean, that just the sheer exploitation of these people, uh, it really, it's not real hard to see why they became not so big of fans of capitalism. It's not too hard to understand why they turned to socialism. I mean, like I said, looking back through some of that stuff, had I lived in that same time period, I don't know if I would have been, but I could see myself being a lot more predisposed towards socialism. However, I've got about 150 years worth of historical knowledge on those people, so yeah, I see that shit doesn't end well. So I am gladly not now, but I could see how a guy would be turned on by socialism back in those days. So um, and it's really really the meatpacking industry is what really paved the way for a lot of legislative reform to these major industries, and it's whether it was good or not. I think like most regulation, had very good intentions. It simply was to protect the quality of of the food that people were buying, and keep these corporate giants from just getting away with murder. Literally, in a lot of cases, it was that there was cases where um, I forget which packer it was, but probably all of them at one point or another shipped a whole bunch of tainted meat to the American soldiers over in the Spanish American War, over on Cuba, and a bunch of them got sick and a bunch of them died. And then you have this muckraking author write this horrifying book about the plight of the foreign immigrant, that's just dirt beyond, like less than dirt poor, coming from Europe, and just not a great life in these packing towns. And it's like I said, it was the industry that really kicked off a lot of reforms that led to a huge swell in union membership, and really kind of turned the tide on the public image of some of these meat packing giants. Not that they were always very well thought of, because well, it's a nasty industry. It's a live animal, then it's a dead animal, and then there's all the stuff that goes with that animal: the piss, the shit, the blood, the guts, the hide, and most of them were on the outskirts of town. That's where they made them stay, because they didn't the city folk didn't want that stank up in here, and so that was, I would imagine, the yards are on the south side of Chicago, where it's typically been a rough area, but it always has been. Dodge City, Kansas was a shithole back in the day. It's a shithole today with two packing plants. It's a flood of poor immigrant labor, doing but now they make pretty good money. But anyways, I'm rambling now, but I think I've got a pretty good, like we're getting closer to some really cool, interesting episodes, particularly on this next one, and then as we get into the more of the bird, how they dispersed these packing giants, and how they slowly but surely, like, new ones would pop up and they would integrate, and now that we've got where you have a poultry industry that is like completely vertically integrated. You got a hog industry that's completely vertically integrated, and a beef industry that's um, all but vertically integrated. And it's kind of the last holdout, and we're seeing a lot of the same issues we've always seen with these meat packing giants, labor issues, um, ranchers and feedlots, um, kind of getting the raw end of the deal, while the packing giant makes record outrageous profits. I don't know if there's any profit that's outrageous for me, but some of the way they handle their business, and price fixing and collusion, and it's a pretty common theme throughout the animal agriculture industry. It's it's been that way for quite some time, and the packing giants are consistently right at the center of it. So it's going to be a couple really good ones coming up. But I think, just to set the stage, where you have this booming new nation, I'm going to try to look at some of the British packing industry as well, during that time. Maybe some European stuff, but I particularly England, because they really industrialized pretty quick, and I wonder what that was like over there, if they had the same kind of, I would imagine so, the same kind of issues with their packing industry. And but then, particularly in America, it just, as the advent of the railroad, and then the refrigerated rail car, who the this Swift guy, he actually ended up buying the cars themselves, because the railroad said they were going to partner on them, and then eventually didn't. So the guy ended up buying the cars themselves, and then leasing them to the railroad, just so he could get the beef back east. That's because that's where the demand was, because that's where all the factories were. And it yeah, as the more mechanized it became and automated to a degree, the less need for highly skilled labor, and so, but the increase for just pure laborers was kind of through the roof, particularly depending on the time of the year. With cattle, there's always like surges in population, and then there's it's very seasonal. So in the down times, you'd have a bunch of laid off workers, or your hours would go way down, therefore your your paycheck would go way down, and it was a pretty volatile industry, and always has been. But we'll look into like some of the guys that built the early packing industry, some of the ways they did it, some of the good things they did, and then a ton of the bad stuff. And I think it's a fascinating look, and kind of, it's one of the few industries, I think, like, no matter how much automation you have, you're not going to automate a cow. I mean, well, I take that back. They're trying to automate a cow, or at least a cut of a cow. And whether that takes off and people actually eat that shit, I don't know. But until then, you're always going to have a live animal as your starting point. So it's one of those industries you're not going to completely automate, just fully automated, I don't think. And it's with that, you deal with large amounts of labor, and with that becomes a whole different deal. And it's just a really interesting story throughout time of that struggle between capital and labor and urban and rural, and then just the sheer fact that regardless of it's capital, labor, urban, rural, rich, poor, every one of them motherfuckers got to eat, and somebody's got to provide it. So it's whether we like them or not, those Packers are they're needed, but also fuck them. They're kind of some assholes too. So it's I think that's kind of my view of this whole packing industry. Well, boy, we need them. They've done some cool shit, but also fuck them. They're a bunch of assholes. And yeah, we'll go further into depth on that particular notion later, but I think we'll wrap it up there. We're right at an hour, so appreciate you guys tuning in. If you'd like to help support the show, please go to patreon.com/Burnin Daylight. You can subscribe there, and you get some bonus episodes. You get ad-free episodes, and you also get bonus segments, particularly if it's post-politics. We always do an extra little bit just for the Patreon folks, and we go hard in the paint. So please go sign up and share this stuff around if you would. If you enjoy what I do, I'd like to grow the audience some. I'd like to be able to make a little bit of money at it and make this kind of a full-time thing. And I'm working on it. We're getting there. But it all helps with if you guys share my stuff and tell your friends about it if you think they'd like it. So please do. And but more than anything, thanks for listening. So appreciate it, and y'all have a great week. Now move your ass. We're burning daylight.
Your eyes up in the morning beneath the stars so bright. Pull your hat down, make sure your cinch is tight. Horses kinda snuffy, cold chill up your spine. We'll get your ass moving, son, we're burning daylight. Burning daylight. Burning daylight. In the saddle till the job's done right. Just together, and you won't catch 'em all. But when you ride through the gate, make sure you sit up tall. I can see the horizon, it's looking pretty bright. Well, get your ass moving, son, we're burning daylight. Burning daylight. Burning daylight. In the saddle till the job